Imagine a scandal so dangerous that an entire empire tried to bury it. A king in love, a government in panic, and a secret that almost broke the British crown. This isn't fiction. In 1936, the most powerful monarchy on earth collided with something it couldn't control: desire. But here's the twist. This forbidden affair wasn't just about romance. It threatened the very stability of the British Empire. So how did one love story force a king to choose between his throne and his heart? Across Europe, newspapers shouted the scandal. In Britain, silence. For months, the public had no idea their king was secretly entangled with an American divorcee. Editors met behind closed doors with palace officials. Stories were killed, names were omitted. It was a national cover-up in real time. But why were politicians, press barons, and church leaders all terrified of one woman? And what did they know about Edward VIII that the public didn't? To answer that, we need to rewind. Back before he was king. Before he was Edward VIII, he was the glamorous Prince of Wales, adored by crowds, splashed across newspapers, the very image of modern royalty. During World War I, he toured the front, shaking hands with wounded soldiers, earning their affection but rarely their respect. Off-duty, he chased parties, fashion, and affairs. Politicians whispered that he was charming, but shallow, impulsive, and dangerously emotional. Britain expected him to one day rule a global empire. Instead, he was about to fall for a woman the establishment considered utterly unacceptable. Enter Wallis Simpson. Born in Baltimore in 1896, twice married, sharp-tongued, and unapologetically ambitious. By the early 1930s, she was circulating in elite London society, introduced to the Prince of Wales through mutual friends. At first, she was just another guest at his parties. But Wallis was different. She didn't swoon over him. She joked, teased, even mocked the man everyone else worshipped. Edward was hooked. What began as friendship quickly deepened into emotional dependence. And there was one more problem. Wallis wasn't just married. Her husband was very much alive. By 1934, Edward and Wallis were inseparable. She dined at his home, holidayed with him, and appeared at intimate gatherings once reserved for royalty. The prince showered her with gifts and confessions, ignoring royal protocol and gossip. Courtiers watched in horror as foreign diplomats quietly spread rumors. British intelligence filed reports. The government feared more than immorality. They feared vulnerability. A king in waiting obsessed with a controversial woman could be manipulated. But that wasn't the only problem. Wallis was now seeking a divorce, and Edward was openly talking about marriage. Outside Britain, subtle secrecy turned into screaming headlines. American and European papers ran photographs, whispers, and speculation. The heir to the British throne was romantically involved with Mrs. Wallis Simpson. British tourists read the stories abroad, then returned home to stony media silence. The political class knew the truth. The people did not. This information gap became dangerous. By 1936, when King George V died and Edward became king, his private life was already a public liability overseas. And then something happened that made the crisis impossible to ignore. Edward VIII ascended the throne in January 1936. Instead of preparing for a coronation, he focused on Wallis. He refused to give her up. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin watched with growing alarm. Britain was facing unemployment, imperial tensions, and the rising threat of Nazi Germany. Yet the king skipped red boxes of state papers, preferring long phone calls and weekends with Wallis. When she filed for divorce in October 1936, insiders heard the unthinkable. Edward intended to marry her and insisted she become queen. Constitutionally and politically, that was dynamite. At 10 Downing Street, the crisis turned deadly serious. Under Church of England doctrine, the king was its supreme governor. Marrying a twice-divorced woman with 2 living ex-husbands was unacceptable. Dominion governments, Canada, Australia, South Africa, Ireland, were consulted. One by one, they rejected the idea of Queen Wallis. Baldwin confronted Edward. he could not marry Wallis and remain king. Edward pushed back, suggesting a morganatic marriage. He'd stay king. She'd never be queen. But Britain wasn't a small German principality. The cabinet, dominions, and church refused. The empire was drawing a line. Until November 1936, the British public remained largely in the dark. Then, the dam broke. On November 2nd, a speech by a bishop hinted at royal moral issues. Foreign reports became impossible to ignore. Finally, British newspapers printed the story: The King and Mrs. Simpson. The illusion shattered overnight. Some were scandalized. Others were fascinated. Many felt betrayed. As questions mounted, the constitutional dilemma sharpened. Could an unelected king defy his elected government just to marry the woman he loved? The answer would rip through the heart of the monarchy. Wallis, bombarded by press hostility and government pressure, briefly left for France, becoming the unwilling centre of a global storm. Edward, meanwhile, dug in. He saw himself as a modern romantic hero, standing up to a stuffy establishment. But his own behaviour undermined him. Reports linked him to dangerously naive views of Nazi Germany, including sympathetic comments about Hitler's regime. To ministers, this wasn't just about marriage, it was about judgment. Could they trust this man with war and peace, colonies and crises, when he seemed unable to control his own personal life? By December 1936, Edward faced a brutal choice: crown or companionship. The cabinet was united. The dominions were firm. The Archbishop of Canterbury was implacable. There would be no Queen Wallis. Baldwin made it clear: if Edward married her and refused to abdicate, the government would resign, triggering a constitutional meltdown. On December 10th, Edward signed the instrument of abdication, witnessed by his brothers. The next evening, he addressed the nation by radio, uttering the now famous line: he could not carry the heavy burden of kingship without the help and support of the woman I love. The reaction? Mixed and dangerous. Some listeners were moved by his romantic sacrifice. Others were furious that a king had plunged the country into crisis for personal reasons. Inside the establishment, there was quiet relief, but also fear. If the monarchy looked like a soap opera, what did that say about the empire it symbolized? Within hours, Edward was no longer king. His brother, the shy, stammering Duke of York, became George VI. Suddenly, the man never meant to rule now carried responsibility for an empire teetering between depression, nationalism, and looming war. George VI's reign became the antidote to the scandal. Where Edward was glamorous and reckless, George was dutiful, reserved, and visibly burdened. With his wife Elizabeth and their daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth II, he projected stability. During World War II, he stayed in London through the Blitz, visiting bombed neighbourhoods and troops. This quiet resilience slowly restored faith in the monarchy. Yet the abdication had lasting consequences. It exposed how fragile the crown truly was, and how easily the personal life of one monarch could endanger the image of the entire empire. Edward became the Duke of Windsor, marrying Wallis in France in 1937. Neither the royal family nor the British government ever fully trusted them. Their 1937 visit to Nazi Germany, including a meeting with Adolf Hitler, remains one of the most controversial episodes in royal history. Historians still debate their sympathies and naivety. Exiled, glamorous, and increasingly irrelevant, they lived out their days as society curiosities. Meanwhile, the empire they nearly destabilized was shrinking, battered by war and independence movements. The scandal faded, but its shadow never fully disappeared. So, did a forbidden affair nearly collapse the British Empire? Not in a single dramatic stroke, but it exposed just how vulnerable that empire was. One man's obsession forced governments across continents to coordinate, newspapers to censor themselves, and a monarchy to reinvent its image. It shaped how later scandals were managed, from Princess Margaret to Diana and beyond. In the end, the empire survived, but the illusion of an untouchable, unshakable crown did not. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the unknown, subscribe for more uninteresting history.